So, welcome back to 3rd Age Reforged and to another battle replay on the test build, which grows ever closer to release. And this is also going to be another Dwarven-inspired map. So recently we did see Erebor just before Christmas, and this one is, I don't know exactly when this one is going to release, but it will probably be in the early stages of 2024. I'm trying to record in bulk as it stands at the moment, albeit this one, unlike Erebor, is intended as more of a regular settlement, and you can kind of see that because it has very much the same kind of footprint as a regular Medieval 2 settlement, albeit it has a Dwarven tile set applied to it, and it's got a few unique bits and pieces as well, even regarding its road layout and such, in comparison to those old style Medieval 2 settlements, which often had a tendency to be far more constricting than it would initially appear to be. But this one, even though it is a Dwarven one, and they do tend to focus on choke point warfare, especially when defending their own settlements, there are a few more open areas, but certainly in terms of overall square footage, we are going to be looking at something a little smaller than an Erebor here, but still I'm sure I can find an appropriate place on the map to make this. We've got the standard sort of Medieval 2 setup really in many ways, where you have an outer area. There's kind of a sub-outer area as well here with these walkways, which can be used to put units on top of as well, just as we head up to the final stand and the keep over here, which should actually be a pretty lethal place to make a final stand if you have enough left in reserve at the end, just because you can put your own units up on these walls and shoot backwards as the enemy tries to make their way up to the town centre. So some good layout here. And of course the dwarves do love a good defensive position, but we will go through the attackers first and foremost when it comes to the actual units themselves. And rather far from home we have Harad. I'm sure that they are not too comfortable in this kind of environment with the snow around. Scarcely seen, I'm sure, in their homeland. But Dismounted Serpent Guard, now they're a good enough infantry unit. They're more intended to be a more numerous infantry unit now, with 203 men in the unit, so individually speaking they are going to lack a little bit more. I mean, if you look over at the Gondor infantry and Arthedain men-at-arms, for example, they too have been given the same kind of treatment, where they're pretty basic in terms of what they offer individually, but the increased numbers do help them, and the armour upgrade does bring them a little bit more into line with their counterparts from the Western Kingdoms of Men as well. But of course, under normal circumstances that may be a real selling point, but when you're talking about facing off against Dwarven defenders in a dug-in position, what you really want is all of those defensive attributes that the Westerners have to be doubled down on, really, which Harad don't really do. Even with the armour upgrade, the shield value is going to be a little bit lower than those kind of units. They do have a little bit more about them in melee, perhaps a little bit more finesse, but we'll see how much of a difference that makes in the long run here against the kind of quality that Dwarven defenders are likely to bring to the table. It's other areas where Harad are going to be pretty good against the dwarves. The South Run pikemen do represent a cheap unit of pikes, of course, which are always going to be somewhat useful for attackers. I mean, some of the Dwarven factions now do have access to some pretty damn good archers, which of course are going to be the first port of call for dealing with a lightly armoured pike unit like this. Very fragile, both at range and also when their formation gets broken in melee, but ultimately if they're unsupported, then something has probably gone wrong previous to them being committed. If they start to run away for such reasons. Another unit of Dismounted Serpent Guard here. We have a unit of Haradrim Spearmen pushing up the ram, of course a very cheap unit of very basic spears. Many of the evil factions have this kind of unit. Most factions tend to have militia. Spears are a very popular weapon to arm them with. Simple anti-cavalry does give them a little bit more of a defensive edge as well, and just keeps them standing a little bit longer perhaps. But the evil factions in particular tend to have some real problems in terms of keeping themselves alive individually. The Haradrim Spearmen are a step up from stuff like the Orc Fodder perhaps, but still, against the level of opponent they're going to be up against here, they're very much here for their numbers and their ability to push war engines more than anything else. The Haradrim Ballista is also in here. I wonder if we can actually get a peek at them through their standard stuff perhaps, but still, Southron Spearmen in melee as well, which do have that little bit of armour piercing, which armour piercing is Harad's main weapon against a force like the dwarves. The quality discrepancy is even more apparent when you compare Harad to the dwarves in comparison to Harad against someone like Gondor, but even still, the savagery of their abilities in melee with that armour piercing will still give the dwarves pause, especially with some of their higher tier units, more Serpent Guard. So plenty of the rank and file here for Harad, and they also have some Beast Hunters, Javelins, of course, something else that they specialise in, which there are some more open areas of the settlement, and if the dwarves do pick the wrong position to make their defence in, Javelins are the sort of thing which can really punish them for that. We'll see if these Beast Hunters can be used in such a way. We do have the Mumakil here as well. I mean, we've seen in offensive sieges before the Beasts of Gorgoroth be used to great effect, and the Mumakil are even stronger than their counterparts from Mordor. It's always been a real selling point of Harad, and especially now that monstrous units are a little bit more scary. We'll see if the Mumakil can do their thing here. I mean, it's a small settlement. The dwarves definitely have the ability to make the Mumakil's lives very difficult, even in spite of their newly increased strength, but we will see. And finally, the Demons of the Desert, the only Trollman variant we've actually seen from Harad in this army, which is bold, because all of the Trollmen would be one of the most obvious things to bring against the dwarves in terms of just blunt effectiveness. The Demons of the Desert may be the most risky, but also the most rewarding because of how much damage you can do very, very quickly with those javelins, but the right angle needs to be found, and you also need to keep them safe from dwarven missiles. Now, moving on, in support we have Rhudaur, played by Froggy, actually fairly similar in terms of factions that have a lot in common. They may be geographically very disparate, but Rhudaur and Harad do share much in the way of strengths. The Rhudaur swordsmen, less numerous and less quality focused than the Serpent Guard perhaps, or more numerous I should say, but yeah, that's really the thing there. Kind of a happy middle ground between the Orcish infantry, which tend to have 250 odd unit models, and the standard human equivalent, which tend to have just over 200. Again, defensive abilities are not really Rhudaur's strong suit. Their armour is a little bit weaker, certainly in comparison to their fellow Arnorians, but even in comparison to Harad's Serpent Guard here, Harad aren't generally known for their extremely high armour, but they do have Rhudaur beat in terms of their regular line infantry unit here. But the extra numbers will be helpful, and ultimately their melee stats are not terrible for what they are. Rhudaur clansmen as well, basic unit of spears. We've already mentioned how spears can have that little defensive edge to them. The big shields as well will help them against the archers that Khazad and Ered Luin tend to bring. But ultimately, again, while Rhudaur do tend to be a little bit more damage focused in melee in terms of unit categories, they're going to really struggle against the kind of quality that the dwarves have 1-to-1. But this fight is unlikely to be 1-to-1, of course. The numbers very much favouring the attackers here. A catapult crew as well. The barbarians manning them, a two-handed spear unit. Obviously going to be trying to crumble the walls, and as a standard medieval 2 style settlement, there will be plenty of areas where walls can be crumbled and new openings can be made. Just in behind we have the Witch Realm Enslavers, bodyguard tier armour piercing. Always going to be a very tempting bring for any attacker when you know that the dwarves are on the defence, which is why I'm slightly surprised to not see champions of Neferat. Ferodrim javelins are here also, with javelins ready, and then obviously a two-handed armour piercing club in melee as well. Less effective than the Enslavers as a melee unit, but more well-rounded because of their javelins. Similar story with the Franadine Berserkers as well, albeit they are an axe-throwing unit first and foremost. And then more javelins in front with the Etenmoor's Troll Hunters. Nice bit of armour piercing burst damage there, which is going to be the key for Rhudaur here, because obviously they're not going to be able to go toe-to-toe with the dwarves in terms of sheer quality. Yet another armour-piercing centric faction in Rhun, commanded by Infinity here. Carmel's Immortals, pretty damn good as far as a unit of their cost goes when it comes to pure melee, though the lack of a shield for this kind of unit does mean that archers can be particularly efficient against them, though as a lower end unit maybe you don't want to use your ammunition on them. Definitely a valid choice for the dwarves and a problem they may have to deal with. The first examples of attacking archers we've seen, the Nar Rim, flaming projectiles. I mean, attacking archers against the dwarves may be a little bit more difficult to use, but it's always worth bringing this kind of long range option as the attackers in some capacity, because it helps put pressure on the defenders and where they choose to try and make their stand. Shadowbow's already firing, but that's probably because of Fire at Will. I imagine that will be rectified in Shaw's order. Very damaging though. We've seen rangers be used to brutal effect, mainly for the defenders actually in these previews recently, but we'll see if the attackers can do the same here. Balcleth Tribesmen, more basic javelins, which we've seen from both Rhudaur and Harad so far, which will be very important, you sense, in trying to prise the dwarves away from the choke points they're inevitably going to try and plug. Several units of Gamprim. I mean, halberdiers are always going to be useful for the armour piercing and phalanx formation combination that they offer. The dwarves do have pikes to help counteract their reach in melee, however, and also just in general supporting units as well in a settlement like this, so we'll see if they can get a foothold. But if they can, it's one of those armour-piercing melee tools that Rhun have that can be incredibly useful. Balcleth Tribesmen in here as well. The Flag Rim, ever iconic of course, is the runic mainline unit. Armour-piercing line infantry as well, gives them that extra leg up in comparison, certainly to Rhudaur, but also to the Serpent Guard on the other side. That armor piercing will allow them to maybe not go evenly blow for blow with some of the higher tier Dwarven units, but it will be more of a problem, and of course those incremental wins do build up for the attackers over time. Scion Rim, a thoroughly defensive unit, fairly expensive for what they are, but, well, in this matchup at the very least, just because the Dwarves do have the tools to deal with these very defense-minded units that pack on the armour and don't do that much damage in return because of the Spear Malice, but ultimately the Scion Rim do still serve an important purpose for being that really solid unit at the centre of the rest of the runic units. If the Halberdier line can't be the anchor, then it does fall on a unit like this to try and shore up the runic defences and keep their attack going for as long as possible. Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen with their throwing projectiles, I mean, if you get them into melee, they can also be pretty damn good. I mean, the Dwarves don't have the same level of skill that these guys do. And then we also have the E-Strong crossbows as well. As I've often said, like, crossbows in an attacking capacity like this, if you can get them into a defensive position on the walls, for example, or something like that, and you can shoot into the defensive lines, it can be the sort of thing which defenders can't really come back from. 2 units of them, but they are pretty fragile. Among all the crossbows, in fact, the E-Strong crossbows may be the most fragile, except for maybe the Corsairs, but at least they can hide. And finally, last but not least, we have Tweak playing as a second Rhudaur army, a couple of units of Rhudaur swordsmen, some Rhudaur marksmen as well, so they're also bringing some long range, though they're going to be a little bit less able to do damage than the Nar Rim from Rhun, but they do have a spear on their back, so if there is any danger of chariots, for example, sallying out, it is the sort of thing to maybe give a little bit more pause to the Dwarves. The upgrades on the Rhudaur Clansmen as well, just to give them that extra bit of rigidity. Again, that won't be too much of a problem for the high quality of the Dwarves. They will crack through that chainmail anyway, but it will just keep them standing for that little bit longer, and they will do a better job of that at the very least than the Rhudaur swordsmen. And I mean, you could argue that that's all this kind of unit is really here to do, so maybe it is the wise move, but there are slightly less of them. These are the trade-offs that you make. We'll see how each of these 2 units does. We have more of the Attenmore's Troll Hunters and more of the Enslavers, more Frandenheim Berserkers as well, which is not too surprising. And finally we have the Blackwolves, a Berserker class unit. Defensively, the hit points are really the only things they have going for them, but of course it's on the attack where they're really going to earn their stripes here against the Dwarves, being a very attack-focused, armour-piercing infantry unit. Now then, let's have a look at what we have on the defence. We have Eclipse, who sent me this battle replay, so big thank you to him, doing a lot of the doing a lot of hard work at the moment to gather these games together and sort of help make that final push in terms of seeing what's what in this version of the game. We have Sons of Durin on the walls. I mean, armour piercing is certainly something which all of the Dwarves don't lack for. We saw Erebor in the very last battle replay. But on this occasion, not too many of the attackers. In fact, only really Rhun are going to really feel the sting of armour piercing units that hard. I mean, Harad and Rhudaur do without it, but they don't really supplement that with that much skill either, so the base damage of this kind of unit will still very much do the business. Mr. Sneakman is going to be playing as Khazad. In terms of overall quality up front, Khazad probably have the most of the Dwarven force, and this really is kind of epitomised actually in the 3rd Legion Infantry when you upgrade them like this, because they are a cut above what other kinds of units are, and they do have a claim for being the best unit of this type that the game has to offer, up alongside the Imladris Guardians and the like. If you're willing to spend a little bit more on a line infantry unit and you want to upgrade their armour, you can't really go too far wrong with this kind of unit, and they will be a problem with those axes as well for all of the lower end units that are coming their way. Guards of Khazad, again, armour piercing, but it's not really the most important thing here. The important thing is going to be the quality that the Dwarves have at the high end, and whether or not the defenders can crack through that. The damage that the Guards of Khazad can do against armoured and unarmoured foes is extreme. Ironfoot warriors with the upgrades as well, so they may be basic, but against these kind of foes, especially when you upgrade their armour, they can be very, very efficient, and they're going to be one of the first lines of defence here. So we'll see how Eclipse's rank and file does. Also, locked morale on the Hammers of Gundabad. Once again, the armour piercing not going to be the most effective thing, but that locked morale is going to be a real boon. It will keep the Dwarves fighting. Khazad in general will stand and fight for an awfully long time, but locked morale is always going to be an important and very useful facet to a unit. The Mithril Guard, that 3rd hit point, probably going to be the single best unit for facing off against most of what the attackers have on the field today. Ered, Luin and Erebor don't really have an equivalent to the Meteor Guard, or at least not one that does it to the same standard that they do. Very, very powerful unit indeed. We have the 1st Legion Pikes. Really, really strong unit this. Sentries of Khazad also joining them. We have Khazad Reclaimers, 2 units of them. High tier Spears in the Sons of the Fallen. And also some 4th Legion Shield Guard here with the armour upgrades as well. Another unit of Sons of the Fallen. So a tough front line this indeed for Harad to try and break through. Most of the initial bit is Spears though. The Pikes, especially the 1st Legion ones, are very capable of dealing damage for the kind of unit they are. But a lot of the burst damage is going to come from axe throwers, but still, that is a lot of heavy dwarven metal they're going to have to try and get through. If they go via the ground level, if they try and scale the walls, that's where the 3rd Legion are, maybe a little bit more able to deal damage quickly to those Haradran soldiers in melee. Several units of them though, very willing to take a forward step here by the looks of things. And then we have Ered Luin, played by Mevin, Defenders of the Blue Mountains, of the rank and file Spears for them, which will still very much do the business against most. We've got the Wardens of Thorin's Halls, the Thorin's Halls units, pretty much the equivalent to the Legion of Khazad, or I guess stuff like the Erebor Legionaries and the upper end units in that regard from Erebor. You can see that they're a dual wielding unit, so maybe not quite as defensively adept, but in this sort of situation it's not really the end of the world because they're not having to wade through a ton of arrow fire. Instead they can focus all on, particularly up on the walls and fights like that. I think the Wardens of Thorin's Halls will be very good, and they should find themselves very much at home at dealing with Rhudaur. Warriors of the Blue Mountains are the basic unit of line infantry, again similar to the Ironfoots and such. The Juggernauts, a bodyguard tier unit for Ered Luin, pretty much the big brother to the Wardens of Thorin's Halls, and behind them bigger axes, and just in general they're going to again be pretty good against the kind of units they're facing off against. The main problem for them might be throwing axes and the like, and javelins. If they can avoid them, they should be as efficient a unit as you could hope to be. Warriors of the Blue Mountains, more 3rd Legion. We've got Marksmen of Thorin's Halls up here as well, heavy archers which are going to be firing immediately. If anything, Ered Luin bring that to the table more so than other dwarves in terms of archery, which should help them in this kind of battle, though also crossbows of Erebor, something that they bring to the table. Is that going to be the sort of thing which the attackers simply cannot reconcile with? More Marksmen of Thorin's Halls, Ironfoot crossbows as well, 2nd Legion Axe Guard way back here with the armour upgrade. We've got the Stone Hewers, which are a basic unit of shock infantry from Ered Luin, some Ironfoot Pikes from Eclipse, the Grenadiers of the Blue Mountains, so a sort of Nafatoon-esque unit this. Interested to see how they perform in a real battle situation, because it's the first time we've seen them on my channel at the very least. Yeah, look kind of like sappers, which is pretty neat with their little sacks on their back to carry all of their gear. And finally over on this gate, some miners, some Ironfoot Pikes, Ironfoot Warriors, maybe the least defended approach this, which is interesting because Rhun maybe offer the biggest all-round threat of all of the forces, but you have to sort of prioritise, and they also have the furthest distance to travel before they're in a position to threaten the town centre, so that is another thing to consider with this sort of settlement layout, and some upgraded Ironfoot Warriors as well. So I don't think there's really going to be much need for a cut in this battle, considering the proximity of all of these units. So I suppose, without any further waffling, let's get this show on the road, shall we? This really is, I think, going to come down to whether or not the armour piercing that is spread across all of the attacking factions today is going to be enough to overcome the gap in quality that clearly exists between the factions. And also here with the dwarves that are on display today, when all 3 of them are working in tandem, they really do cover for one another really very well, I think. Khazad with their sheer upfront quality, Erebor with some of that close range punch that they can offer in backup of their own heavy infantry, and then perhaps the more well-rounded support that the dwarves of the Blue Mountains provide. It does make for a pretty heady mix. Even if all of them are susceptible to the same sort of counters, they can still offer different things in terms of dealing damage to the enemy. When the arrow towers begin opening up early doors here, that is something else to consider as well. It is one of those settlements where arrow towers are going to be a factor in proceedings. Of course, not the most devastating tool, but still the sort of thing which can prevent the attackers from dithering for too long. Interesting that there are 2 Rhudaur armies as well. I mean, the close range support that Rhudaur offer themselves is potentially devastating, but A settlement like this, where the terrain, at least in the initial part of the settlement, is relatively unremarkable, they will need to take the walls if they hope to really take full advantage of that. Rhun lagging behind their allies just a little bit. Rhudaur clansmen already battering down one of the reinforced gates. I mean, it is this section of the settlement, as we said, technically the longest route to the town centre, where the dwarves are maybe a little bit more undermanned than they are in different sections of the settlement. Erebor taking majority ownership of that part of the settlement. Ered Luin marshalling the approach from the west, and then the south being covered primarily by Khazad. But this settlement, unlike Erebor that we saw the dwarves attempting to defend the last time we saw any of these factions, because of how much smaller this is, they will be able to come to one another's aid a little bit more easily than on that particular battle. Meanwhile, that is a pretty devastating early blow, you would suggest. There's quite a lot of upgraded 3rd Legion infantry who have already succumbed. Already as well. I mean, this is a fairly rare thing, actually. Very often we see the siege towers set up and then they leave it a little bit before they actually attempt to storm the walls, but Rhudaur wasting no time here. Rhudaur swordsman from Froggy. Now they are going up against the Juggernauts, which is going to be a problem for them. I mean, the Rhudaur swordsman should get torn asunder fairly effectively, but the Juggernauts haven't managed to surround them, so they could yet actually clear a spot on the walls relatively hassle-free. Still the small matter of these Ironfoot crossbows. Firing away, taking a few odd pot shots to the other Rhudaur army, who have also wasted no time in attempting to get up onto the walls. I mean, individually speaking, the Ironfoot warriors are not quite on the same level as the Juggernauts, but they do represent a more numerous force, the Dwarven miners in backup. I had forgotten, actually, a lot of these standard medieval 2 settlements, which technically speaking this works off of a template of something very similar. The announcer does tend to go a bit buck wild in the early game because of all the siege towers and crumbling walls and battered down gates that there tends to be. Dwarven miners struggling a little bit more. I mean, their defensive stats proving to be a bit of a problem against the sheer weight of numbers of the Rhudaur swordsmen. Hopefully we see the dwarves take a more active role in trying to defend some of these outer positions than we saw in the Erebor battle, because it was a bit of a mistake in that situation. We saw them in there where they ended up surrendering the momentum and were in too deep a hole to dig themselves back out of it. Ironfoot pikes, meanwhile, pretty comfortable against this singular unit of Rhudaur clansmen, Erebor legionaries, trying to surround the Rhudaur axemen, whose armour piercing is useful, but you can see here the melee defense being heavily taken advantage of there. Defeat seems certain for them. I think actually we will at least temporarily go down to half speed just to get a good look at everything that's going on in these early stages. The Ram already moving through. I think Infinity's Rune army is going to have the easiest time of it, at least initially, just because Rhudaur have already cleared a spot on the wall where they can come to the direct aid of Rhudaur, or Rhun I should say, so they can link up with one another and try to deal with Erebor as a twosome. The Erebor legionaries, I mean, they can still do a fair amount of damage to these expeditionary units that Rhudaur have sent forward Erebor, but they need to be a little bit careful not to undercommit in these positions. The Eclipse does have the Sons of Durin over here, who AP shock infantry to AP shock infantry will easily have the beating of this other unit of Rhudaur axemen that are being sent forward. But I do like how aggressive the attackers are being here in terms of blanketing the walls. Even if they are going to be losing some of these engagements, they are also going to be putting on enough pressure to be able to, particularly in this part of the settlement, start to gain some yardage fairly quickly. Over here, of course, the early stages, not completely crumbling that wall, interestingly enough, and the rest of Khazad, they have had only a minor engagement so far, which the 3rd Legion were easily able to wrap up. More of a typical state of affairs here from Harad, setting up their siege towers and ready to utilise them a little bit later on. A second unit of Juggernauts here, also going up against the Rhudaur swordsman. Again, this should be a fairly hard counter. The only potential issue might be in terms of the sheer numbers difference, seeing as the Rhudaur swordsmen have managed to get up onto the walls, but it should be a fairly foregone conclusion that. Meanwhile, these warriors of the Blue Mountains taking hits. Ettenmore's troll hunters throwing their javelins in through the gate. I mean, it's not the most important unit that the dwarves have, but anything they can do with their supporting units is going to be key here. Really try and pile the pressure on in terms of opening up that numbers advantage that they do hold. Any kills are good kills from their perspective. And also, again, Rhudaur clansmen getting onto the walls over here. They are finding these little gaps in the defences, but the Wardens of Thorin's Halls moving down from the upper tier, so there is another potential way up into the town centre via the walls themselves, but they do have another dual-wielding axe unit, not quite as potent as the Juggernauts, but the Wardens of Thorin's Halls will still make pretty quick work of the unupgraded Rhudaur clansmen, you would suggest. Making our way back across, Rhun starting to become more of a fixture. Dwarven miners, the only thing that's really engaging the Golden and Silver Horde so far. Ironfoot pikes trundling forwards as well. I mean, the Gamprim are all well and good, but the Ironfoot pikes do represent a pretty good countermeasure to what would otherwise be a pretty troublesome unit for the dwarves. Elsewhere, starting to see a little bit of ranged fire coming from over the walls, and I mean, walls are getting cleared slowly but surely, so Rhudaur could get their javelins up onto the walls. They could fire down into these troublesome Ironfoot pikes, which have been pretty stalwart on the front line in the early phases here for Erebor, and Dwarven support coming in trying to hit the Blackwolds and the Witch Realm Enslavers, so a real strong point of Rhudaur infantry this. A lot of heavy damage coming the way of this single unit of Erebor legionaries, which are now also surrounded by runic halberdiers. I don't think these guys are going to last for too much longer, as accomplished an infantry unit as they are. It's going to be a difficult task for them to stay standing for too much longer. I mean, there are still quite a lot of Ironfoot warriors on this section of wall. The other walls over on this side of the settlement have seen gains for Rhudaur. Oh, there goes the runic general. Another one of the 3rd Legion went flying there, but finally that section of wall has crumbled. Actually, that might have been a different one. I think I see it in the distance over here. Yeah, dismounted Serpent Guard climbing down from the wall, so Harad claiming some territory over here as well. Good opportunity to link up and take this whole section of the settlement here for the attackers. The only army that will not be able to get in on that particular act is Froggy, but he's got his own battles to fight. Khazad going in hard for defending the gate. Sons of the Fallen, 1st Legion pikes, 3rd Legion infantry. There's no way that the South Roms are going to be able to get through here. The quality differential is simply too high. Forward come the Moonakill, keep an eye on them. They could cause some issues in the settlement itself. Haradrim Spearmen not going to be up to much against the Mithril Guard. Again, especially when it comes to Khazad-dûm's infantry, you can see the difference in quality between themselves and Harad, who are the only ones who have really engaged with them so far. Again, actually, we will need to go down to half speed. There is quite a lot going on. Another unit of Wardens of Thorin's Halls moving forward, the Warriors of the Blue Mountains. Hashari, Ettenmore's Troll Hunters, those are throwing axes as well, so yeah, Troll Short Axe Throwers moving in, trying to go after the Wardens of Thorin's Halls as well, which, compared to some of the other targets, their shields are on their back, so they will be mitigating less of that damage. They are maybe a little bit more of a troublesome unit to try and deal with in melee. These dual wielders suit facing off against most of the units that the attackers have because of the lower emphasis on armour that pretty much all of the Evil Men factions on display have. Warriors of the Blue Mountains and Stone Hewers, the rank and file really of Ered Luin. Those Ettenmore's Troll Hunters having already done a good amount of damage to the warriors getting into melee, but their armour plate will be counteracted by the damage that the Stone Hewers are going to be able to do. Warriors of the Blue Mountains also here in close support as well. Juggernauts, yeah, 55 of them left. A few of them have fallen, but in the long run they've managed to mulch their way through these Rhudaur swordsmen, which is not too surprising. You can see over here where the surrounding of this unit happened, it was a little bit more domineering. There are even more Rhudaur swordsmen where they came from, however, so not being given a whole lot of variety in terms of the units that they're killing, but another single unit of Rhudaur swordsmen is not going to be enough to bring the celebrating dwarves down. The very best of what Ered Luin have to offer in melee, most similar to the Obsidian Guard, of course. Barbarian Catapult moving across, still the small matter of potentially crumbling a few more walls, and over here, once again, you can see another example of the basic Rhudaur units crumbling in the face of a well-suited Dwarven unit. Some good examples of individual Blue Mountains domination here, but here come the Mumakil. This was always the section of the settlement that was most at risk, and Erebor now, they were already slightly compromised, and now they're going to have to try and move away. Dwarven miners being left as a rear guard against the vast majority of the runic infantry. I mean, as much as the Mumakil are significantly tankier than they used to be, if they get caught in a situation like this where there's pikes all around them and there's crossbow bolts and throwing projectiles crisscrossing the battlefield, it isn't going to end that well for them. And there you can see a great example of that as the High Thanes of Azagal, another Blue Mountains high tier unit, focusing down that one Oliphant. And it fell by the wayside. There's still another one left alive in the distance over there, another two over here, but it's really difficult to keep control of your monstrous units when they're scattered like this, although ironically the death of that one probably has made things a little bit easier for WK. It's probably not been the tour de force that he would have wanted so far in this battle, and once again slowly trudging through pikes. Again, if they can land a few blows, they might be able to bring these monsters down a little bit more quickly. These close quarters stomps that they do as well, also good for dealing that AoE damage. Tweak moving forwards, more of the Ironfoot pikes trying to get back into defensive position. Erebor no longer having to man this part of the settlement on their own. Some Blue Mountains units on the way across in addition to the High Thanes that were in support before. So a little bit of extra support for these pikes, which have been good so far. It's just a case of Eclipse has had quite a few angles to try and cover, and it's been a challenge thus far. But now as the battlefield contracts, that should get a little bit easier. Hashari and Dismounted Serpent Guard managing to surround and do some good damage to these Ironfoot pikes. Is that the Grenadiers? Indeed it is. Kind of explosive, kind of like Nafatoons. They're a little bit different. I'm extremely glad of the fact that there isn't camera shake included in these guys. They're taking a lot of damage very quickly though. Unsurprisingly, they're going to be a unit that's the attackers will be attempting to focus down. The settlement is aflame from the Nar Rim. Plenty of support coming in from the Blacklock engineers as well. They're a little bit exposed up on these bridges, but obviously the firing position is far too good to ignore. Harad not making too much in the way of inroads against the rock-solid Khazad defence. I mean, most of Harad, it must be said, have gone around, or most of the effective fighting force of Harad have gone around to try and support their allies over here. This is more of a token gesture, if anything. Some Wardens of Thorin's Halls here as well. Those Rhudaur swordsmen once again being dealt with. A much more even fight this between the Enslavers and the Juggernauts. The Enslavers were fresh as well, so that armour piercing of theirs may very well be enough to give them the slight edge here. The Juggernauts finally being tested in this particular battle. Froggy, the most isolated of all the attacking forces, defeat a distinct possibility for his forces on foot. Again, these Juggernauts have been fighting against units that they should be very good against, in all fairness. What's going on here? A good move from Mavin. Going to be sending his Wardens of Thorin's Halls around as a bit of a flanking force, and nothing left over here from Froggy, so they will be unopposed as a flanking force as well. We shall keep an eye on that. More and more of the settlement, however, getting crumbled. This time Harad going to try and flank around Khazad a little bit. Ironfoot crossbows. I mean, I don't know if the Ironfoot crossbows are going to be able to kill off these archers as quickly as they would like. They've got enough cover in comparison to the shadow bows. As much as the runic archers are doing the right thing by getting up onto the walls, they don't really have a clear shot still because of the battlements that are here. Again, a sign of a well-designed settlement. More of these Ironfoot warriors, very depleted now though, simply holding back Rhun. buying a little bit more time. The Mumakil's scattered across the field, getting themselves back into a defensive shape within these walkways over here. It has been a pretty consistent fighting retreat. As much as the attackers have been taking damage the whole way, they have been making consistent gains within the settlement. Rhudaur Berserkers alongside the dismounted Serpent Guard as well will have the beating of these basic Dwarven spears as well. I was going to say spheres for a second there. Proportionally, I guess they are rounder than the other races. Got some 3rd Legion alongside some sentries of Khazad, but again the Atomor's Troll Hunters in a pretty good position to offer some support. Khazad being put under a little bit more pressure than they have been thus far in the battle. They're still guarding that gatehouse, but they're also putting on another defence for these Haradrim, another dead Mumakil over here. So I mean, they've definitely gone on a bit of a grand tour of the settlement, the Mumakil. I don't know how effective they necessarily were, but they were getting involved in pretty much everyone's business. Kashari going up against 3rd Legion Infantry, guards of Khazad in there as well, so they're not going to do that well in melee. I think they were trying to be manoeuvred to throw their projectiles, but they're not going to be afforded that luxury. Some more Troll Hunters up there, however, going to try and do their thing. I mean, Rhudaur Berserkers will find themselves to be a little bit more of a worthy foe for the Dwarves, but even they are not going to be able to match the Meteor Guard blow for blow, although the Meteor Guard going to get up on the walls to counteract those javelins, the Wardens of Thorin's Halls being left to deal with this situation, but they're a little bit depleted for that. Is that going to work long term? There's still a few Juggernauts left alive. In fact, the 2nd unit of Juggernauts is now up here to put a stop to the Witch Realm Enslavers. That'll be a worthy foe to kill off. Warriors of the Blue Mountains still here. Grenadiers of the Blue Mountains throwing their projectiles in. A bit of friendly fire going on here, but the Blackwolds are dangerous enough to maybe try and focus down with a little bit more vigour. Further back, still got some 9-foot crossbows, although out of ammunition by the looks of things. Grenadiers of the Blue Mountains still there. I mean, in all fairness, these basic Blue Mountain spears have actually done a pretty good job at holding firm in the face of the Serpent Guard and the Rhudaur Berserkers. Again, it does go to show that the basic Dwarven units are going to do better in this kind of situation than most others. Malkoth Tribesmen, don't know what's going on here. Stuck in the corpse of the Mumakil? How bizarre is that? I guess it still views the dead Mumakil as being able to knock units aside. They will get through eventually, I think, but it's going to delay them pretty significantly. 9-foot crossbows, point blank. I mean, counter fire from the Nar Rim. In terms of DPS, there is a pretty serious difference between the two units when there's no obstruction for the crossbows to deal with, but Rhun do have their own crossbows, firing directly off against one another, and Rhun and Rhudaur do have plenty of skirmishes here, so those Ironfoots will find themselves outmatched in the long run here. Is it time to retreat once more? Fortune Javelins on the way forwards. Rhun still have a few units even outside the walls. I mean, not surprisingly, Rhun are probably the attacking faction in the best shape, just based on how things have worked out. Harad, I mean, at this point, are Khazad tempted to retreat and cede some ground to Harad? Possibly. Beast Hunters on the way forward. I mean, yeah, Javelins attacking into the rear of these units isn't something you would want to see. Barbarian Catapult, I mean, going through their own units there, a little bit unfortunate. Plenty of friendly fire inflicted on those Serpent Guardsmen. And friendly fire is not something they needed, considering they're also attracting the attention of the Meteor Guard. That battle can only end one way. Warriors of the Blue Mountains heading outside the settlement, which going after the catapult, or tempted to go after the catapult perhaps, but the Trollshaw Axe Throwers are going to do a good amount of damage to them in response. I mean, they're going to have to stop the Axe Throwers, otherwise this entire counter-attacking force is going to be eliminated. Harad Doing a good job in terms of covering Froggy's catapult, and Ferodrum javelins as well. Maybe this is a little bit of an ill-advised counter-attack. It depends really on how quickly the Wardens of Thorin's Halls can kill off the Troll Shores, who are not a particularly good unit in melee. They're a very cost-effective unit if you can deploy all their ammunition at range, but... Ooh, there goes Mavin's General as well. Interesting choice of General's Bodyguard unit, especially if you're willing to use your warriors this aggressively. Yeah, they're really caught in no man's land here. Maybe a little bit of a misstep this. This part of the Southmont is now largely abandoned. Still a few stragglers here, again dealing with a pretty battered and bruised unit of Trollshore axe throwers, but more and more it is going to be whether or not the attackers can take advantage of the assault that came from the east and the north. Sons of the Fallen and Hammers of Gundabad, a really potent mix of very defensive and very aggressive infantry. The Southrons stopped dead in their tracks. Large amount of projectiles flying overhead. Rhudaur marksmen going after the exposed Khazad reclaimers. The armour will do something for them, but still probably one of the better choices of targets that those Rhudaur marksmen could have gone after. Blacklocks, Ironfoot crossbows, they have ammunition left. Yeah, defenders of the Blue Mountains finally getting routed after being surrounded by the tribesmen. It's all well and good, but I mean it's still pretty even this. Demons of the Desert, ooh, was that a successful volley? 2nd Legion Axe Guard taking hits. I mean they are, again, Blacklock Engineers certainly not the worst targets that they could be going after. Was that it? Was that all of their ammunition? If they've used all their ammunition, then fair enough. Of course, WK going for a relatively Trollman light build for Harad standards. But the Demons of the Desert still can certainly pull their weight in melee as well. And considering the damage already done, you would back them against the Blacklock Engineers here in spite of their own defensive shortcomings. Since the Fallen still doing a really good job. I mean, the quality over here is definitely questionable. Rhudaur marksmen, Ferodrum javelins are all well and good, but this combination of units is not going to be enough considering what Ered, Luin and Khazad have in store for them, and more units marching across as well. 3rd Legion Infantry, I mean that has been the trade-off. Harad, by going this way, have left Khazad to be a little bit healthier in the long run perhaps than Erebor have ended up being. Looping shots from the Rhudaur marksman trying to hit these dwarves in the back and succeeding. There goes the Harad general. Of course, loss of generals is going to be more of a worrying factor for the attackers today. High Thanes of Azagal, already saw them brutally put down one of the Mumakil, and Juggernauts out here as well. I mean, in all fairness, because of the fact that they have doubled down on this counter-attack, it has ended up working out quite well. If they'd left it at those 2 individual Blue Mountains units, I think they would have ended up struggling, but the fact that they've really backed it up with bodyguard units from Ered, Luin, and also a little bit of help from Khazad as well, they have ended up really blunting anything that Froggy would hope to end up doing late on. Or at Wardens of Thorin's Halls, these Ferodrum javelins trying to retreat, but every step of the way they're taking more losses as they have to go through more and more dwarves. One of the better melee units against dwarven opposition that Rhudaur have are the Ferodrum javelins, but they are a little bit, and there we see the general as part of that unit fall. As isolated as they are, their defensive shortcomings are being exploited a bit here. Meanwhile, Eastron crossbowmen going a little bit behind enemy lines. It's a little bit bold to have these guys be the vanguard. They are definitely not going to be up to the task of defeating dwarves on a one-to-one basis, and they're going to need support from the rest of the Runic Infantry Corps. The 2nd Legion Axe Guard was one of the units which was on the receiving end of those volleys from the Demons of the Desert, but still standing, still swinging those axes. And Scion Rim also in close proximity, trudging forwards. And Dragon Slayers, having that sort of unit available to be committed in the late game for Eclipse, I mean that sort of armor piercing as well is going to be very useful against the Scion Rune, who are probably the most heavily armoured singular unit that the attackers have deployed today. So committing an armor piercing heavy hitter at perhaps just the right time, although pulling them back out of melee again. What are they planning on doing here? I mean, there's not a huge amount left. There's the Khazad General. Strong crossbows, managing to arc some shots over here, which is why maybe retreating these Dragon Slayers is not the best idea. Maybe just getting them stuck in to support all of these Khazad units which are still fighting the good fight down here is the way to go. That spike of quality perhaps key. I mean, there's still 64 Mithril Guard. They've been involved in the fight for quite a while against admittedly opposition that aren't really capable of dealing huge amounts of damage to them. The only way the Troll Hunters are really going to be able to do that is if they get some clean volleys off on them, and that wasn't the case. There's also the Guards of Khazad. Yeah, I mean, Rhun pretty much circumventing things here, maybe trying to rush the town centre because of all the quality that Khazad still have at their disposal. I mean, Ered Luin still have a good amount of quality outside the walls as well. I think the defenders are in a pretty good position here, just because I don't think, on an individual level, the attackers are going to be able to displace the dwarves going later into this fight. They really are. I mean, maybe the race to the town centre is the way to go. But the only thing this really achieves is forcing Erebor to be committed to this fight now, which means the Dragon Slayers and what remains of the Ironfoot pikes and crossbows are going to be contributing in melee as well. Rhun themselves are going to be a little bit stretched. Flag Rim can answer with their own armour piercing, but the quality discrepancy, as ever in this particular matchup, is very real. And down the hill, the Ironfoot crossbows as well. Strong crossbowman. The level of quality I think is simply too high. I mean, the Mithril Guard will take a few losses at the hands of something like the Gamprim, but the Runic Halberdiers are a little bit scattered and disparate, their formation a little bit buckled. Sons of the Fallen moving forward. I think one thing we've certainly seen in this fight has been a true demonstration of Khazad melee qualities. The situation has somewhat favoured them because of Harad sort of committing a little bit more elsewhere, so initially that fight was certainly in their favour. I think we've actually seen all of the dwarves do pretty damn well here. Erebor were probably placed under the most stress earlier on, but their pikes and also their crossbows were still able to do a good amount of damage to the attackers on the way through, and clearly the toll on their manpower has been significant, just because that numbers discrepancy, which I'm sure we'll see in the endgame splash screen, was significant, but it's looking pretty meagre at this point in proceedings. Forward move the Flag Rim. Scion Rim, however, trying to push their way through to the town centre. I mean, they will partially be successful. What happened to the Dragon Slayers? 34, I mean, you know, a decent amount of damage. It does go to show that Rhune's armour piercing isn't just for show. This will knock these perpetually routing units back into active service. Getting involved. Delaying Rhun a little bit longer. I mean, they have effectively put all their eggs into this particular basket now. 4 minutes is a long time for that one unit of Scion Rim and Flag Rim to hold on. Although they do have the backstop of these Carmel Shadow Bows, utilising flaming shot as they are. I mean, they're very unlikely to rout a Khazad army that are in the ascendancy, even with the loss of the general, of course, the dwarves. Stout of heart. And now, Guards of Khazad on the way up as well. I'd be yeah, and also the town centre being contested once again. It was kind of Rhune's only option at this point because they were the only army with any sort of strength left when they enacted their town centre rush, so it was kind of a Hail Mary, which I really don't think is going to pay off. But unlike the Siege of Erebor, where we saw the benefits of a significant numbers advantage over a quality heavy force like the Dwarves, here we've seen the opposite. The Dwarven quality has rung true, perhaps on this occasion because a little bit more of a well-rounded force, although Dale should make up for a lot of Erebor's shortcomings as well. But on this occasion, the attacker's just not really up to the task of dealing with the level of opposition that was presented to them. Dragon Slayers, yeah, ripping their way through the Scion Rim, are usually a very sturdy unit when faced with this level of opposition, folding like wet tissue paper. Admittedly not the ideal situation for them to be in. Exposed as they were, still a few volleys coming in from the Eastron crossbows. Not a huge amount left. I mean, it really is only Rhun that are left. Froggy in the east, as he was approaching the settlement from, was a real struggle for him, most isolated. Ered Luin also proving to be a pretty effective force as well in this fight. Those Juggernauts proving their worth in melee alongside the rest of the high-end Dwarven units, the High Thanes, helping to tear through those Mumakil, even the rank and file of Ered Luin, particularly against more lightly armoured factions like this. You can really see their infantry in full flow. There goes the Kamul shadow bows. Eastron crossbow fleeing. So Infinity admitting defeat. So who is still holding on for dear life? It's still a very weird bug, isn't it? The Mumakil causing dead units. I mean, to be fair, they're one of the only units where you can hover over them and there will still be a tooltip sort of saying that they're dead, because I imagine it would get very annoying if all corpses on the field did that. But the Mumakil are big enough to the point where it's maybe worthwhile doing. And this going to be the last unit left, the Barbarian Catapult from Rhudaur, Froggy's army. Technically speaking, the last one left standing. I mean, fair play for remounting this catapult, considering that Blue Mountain's counter-attack really did the business on him. Although, are they going to be able to actually get any volleys off with it? It looks as though they're sort of trudging through nothing, marching on the spot, and the 3rd Legion are bearing down upon them. I can't imagine these barbarians are going to last too long in melee in terms of their... I mean, they are impetuous. Rhudaur in general do have that berserker nature to them, so they can keep fighting a little bit longer than most, but I don't think that's going to pan out this time around. A few of the Blue Mountains forces coming forwards. I'm interested to see which of the Dwarven armies got the most kills, actually, just because even though Erebor probably had the hardest time of it, you know, their crossbows presumably had plenty of opportunities to get good kills. Obviously the Khazad infantry did very well for itself, and the Blue Mountains infantry also. High Thanes of Azagal. You can see they're a halberdier unit in melee, which is interesting. We've only really seen them be a javelin unit in this fight thus far. They're now shaken. The Barbarian Catapult. For Khazad, it begins, or it ends where it began, defending this gate with overwhelming force. And that is going to be a good, solid victory for the Dwarven Brotherhood. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, we're not going to be able to see the kills. That's unfortunate. I will endeavour to put them in the description below if I'm able to dredge them up from somewhere, because, like I said, I was interested to see if, in spite of being put under the most pressure, Erebor were able to secure the most kills, or whether or not the domineering infantry performance of Khazad and Ered Luin saw them through. Of course, ranged units are always one of those things which is hard to keep track of, so the crossbows and the archers and javelins from every faction on display really would be an interesting thing to see. But yeah, you can just see the the various action sites on the battlefield today. Pretty much every part of the settlement was utilised and saw fighting of some level. But yeah, a good victory for the Dwarves. It said there's only a 3% difference, but of course a lot of that comes down to routing. So in reality, it is probably a 10% difference, which is still reasonably close, but considering the defenders were outnumbered by an army, they did very, very well here, and it was an excellent showcase of Dwarven quality, which stands really in contrast to that Erebor fight, like I said, where the Dwarven quality wasn't really enough in the long run against that really overwhelming force of Orcs. But yeah, the evil men not able to replicate that on this occasion. It's a good settlement as well. I'll be interested to see if there are a few others with other architecture types. I mean, we have seen the Elven ones in the past as well, which have been in the game for quite a while actually, so they will remain unchanged, I'm sure, and the Gondorian ones have always been pretty good, but I think there are evil men ones. But yeah, we'll see. Like I said, plenty of showpiece battles I'm sure to come. I mean, this, I think, based on the schedule of things, will probably be the first battle replay to air in the year 2024. This is the last of the replays that I'm recording as well before Christmas, so by the time I get back, it'll be around the same time that this one releases actually, so we'll know a little bit more where we stand with regards to the patch and all of the things that I can start hammering out with regards to my schedule. But yeah, big thank you to Eclipse for sending this one in. This, I think, is more of a collaborative effort, I think, making these more generic sort of campaign map settlements, if you will, for lack of a better word, although I'm sure I can find an appropriate Dwarven settlement name either from the campaign map itself or from some expanded Middle-earth wiki. Of course, I know that some of those can be a little bit liberal with their interpretations, but there are only so many names I can use before I have to start utilising those, and we've long since surpassed that. Yeah, big thanks to Eclipse once again for sharing this and allowing me to showcase this one. Big thanks to all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.